All right. Hey everyone, welcome to World Vision's webinar with Sticky Faith's Kara Powell. Very excited to have a conversation with you today, Kara. Just wanted to give a special shout out to the 30-hour famine leaders out there. For those that had an event in February, thank you so much. Super proud and humbling for us to be a part of what you do with your students in leading them towards a relationship with Christ. Thank you so much for all that you do. We know that Sticky Faith is something that's special to World Vision and particularly the 30-hour famine. So this is a real honor for me today, Kara, to introduce you and have you share a little bit of your work with our leaders and our friends at World Vision. Just wanted to say that also talk about your, that's the back, your Sticky Faith service guide today, a little bit about that. So if you can tell us a little bit about your background and Sticky Faith, that'd be great.
Fantastic. Well, I'm honored to be here, Dan. I'm a huge fan of World Vision and 30-hour famine. And so the chance to dream with you about what 30-hour famine means and how it can be even more effective is thrilling to me. I've been looking forward to this since we put it on the calendar. So I am a faculty member at Fuller Seminary, hence all the books. I love, Dan, your backdrop. It's kids and it's a kid praying, and my backdrop is books. So I just feel like the lame academic at this point, but that's okay. So I'm a faculty member at Fuller, but really my main job is I work with the amazing team at the Fuller Youth Institute. And our mission is to equip young people with the lifelong faith that they need. And we do that by taking the best research that Fuller and others are doing and turning it into practical resources so that any leader, parent, grandparent who longs to see young people have deeper and more robust and more lasting faith has the tools that they need. And personally, I'm quite a fan of justice work and service work. My own life as a teenager was very impacted by going on short-term mission trips and by experiencing service both locally and globally. As I got older, I actually met my husband on a short-term mission trip, and we got engaged on a short-term mission trip, and we bought a house on a short-term mission trip. Not all the same trip, just to clarify. That was 3 different trips. But nonetheless, I just love what God does in the midst of experiences like 30-hour famine, and love thinking with you, Dan, and others about how 30-hour famine can be not just an event, but an overall process that has even more lasting fruit. So thanks to you, Dan, and for everyone who's watching to carve out the time to have even deeper seeds planted in the lives of young people.
Yeah, I think that hits the sweet spot, certainly for us and what we try to do through the famine and our work at World Vision, and certainly with the people that are probably listening with us today. So thanks so much. Just a reminder that as we have this conversation, if any questions arise for anyone, please send them to bnelson@fuller.edu. And there'll be a time at the end when we can speak to some of those questions so we can answer them personally. So let's set the context a little bit, Kara. Can you talk a little bit about the Sticky Faith background and help us understand what started it and maybe a little bit about where you are today?
Yeah. Great question. And I love talking about Sticky Faith. So, really good research indicates that about half of youth group graduates, half of kids from phenomenal youth ministries and phenomenal families, like folks watching this webinar, about half of youth group graduates drew from God and the church after they graduate from high school. And I'm a mom of 2 teenagers and a 9-year-old. As a mom and a leader and a follower of Jesus, I'm not satisfied with that. Dan, I know you and the great team at World Vision isn't satisfied with that. And I know that our watchers and our listeners aren't satisfied with that either. So we received a handful of grants from the Fuller or from various foundations that allowed us to study over 500 young people during their first 3 years in college. I used to say 500 young people through their junior year in college, but we've realized that first 3 years and junior year are not always the same thing. So more technically, it's from their first 3 years in college. To try to figure out what is it that churches can do, what is it that families can do to help young people have those deeper roots so that they have even more fruit. And I just got to say, Dan, that what we learned as we tracked with these young people, it's dramatically impacted my own parenting. It's changed the way that I view our church. It's changed the way that I volunteer in our youth ministry. It's changed the way that I think about friendships. And, adult friendships and what that means for the young people who are, part of those family systems for adults. I mean, just this morning, the way that I interacted with my 13-year-old who was feeling overwhelmed by pressures in school and volleyball and came to me kind of teary. Even just this morning, the way that I interacted with her was different because of our research. So what I love is that we've done this research on young people, and it just has so many implications. So you asked for me to tell a little bit more about Sticky Faith. So out of this research, we've created a number of books, a number of online tools, a fantastic dynamic website, stickyfaith.org, with hundreds of free resources. But really, one of our main themes was, and I'm so glad for this, was the importance of service and justice. That is certainly a part of a lifelong faith. And yet, while I can champion service and justice, unfortunately, a lot of the ways that we are involved in projects like 30-Hour Famine, we are unintentionally sabotaging some of the results. So we're super well intentioned, we're working hard, we're praying hard, we're loving on kids, and yet there are ways that a lot of our service and justice work represent taking 3 steps forward and 2 steps backwards. And so the good news is that's a net of 1 step. We're making progress. But I think many of us, all of us, would say we long to see even more progress, and not so much of that forward, backward, but much more stability and ongoing growth. So the Sticky Faith research, it's touched so many parts of a young person's journey, and especially what it means to help young people experience service and justice.
We, in the last couple of years in Famine, one of the things that we did, with your permission, thank you very much, was to include some what we called sticky notes within the context of the famine. So we highlighted some of the ways that leaders could involve the congregation and do intentional intergenerational events that would help towards that end. So obviously we're big believers. And I love that it comes from a place of research and design and some serious thought and work into that. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about how that has implications of your work towards service and justice particularly.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So as I mentioned, what we've seen from other data is that for so many students who do great service and justice work like 30-Hour Famine, they have this high, but then when it comes to Monday morning and physics class, or that person they see who's homeless as they're driving home from school or whatever it might be, they don't know how to connect the dots between this amazing experience they've had when they serve and real life back home. So all the life change, or I should say so much of the life change, ends up dissipating. And that grieves me. And so part of what we did, and when I say we, I mean Brad Griffin here at the Fuller Youth Institute, and then Brad and I worked very closely with Terry Linhart and Dave Livermore, who are incredible experts when it comes to cultural intelligence, as well as service and justice and short-term missions. We dreamed about what would it look like to have something like 30-Hour Famine, or a 3-day intercity trip, or a week-long trip to Guatemala, whatever it is that we're involving young people in. What would it look like to have it be not just a short event, but to have it be something that becomes a longer process? Now, even when I say that, I know that so many folks are like, oh, I'm so busy already, and now you're asking me to do more. And yes and no, and I'll unpack why that's a yes and a no in just a moment. So what we came up with out of our research, and this is well explained in the Sticky Faith Service Guide that's available now, but what we came up with is a process that highlights that event, but that doesn't just stop there. So we call it a before, during, and after process. I know, very creative. Oh, the hours we spent on branding that. But before, during, and after. And so your during is your 30-hour famine, to be sure. But let's ask a very important question. What are you doing beforehand to prepare young people for what they're going to experience in the famine? Specifically questions like, how are you helping young people even understand why they do the famine? And, they might think they're doing the famine because so many other my friends are doing, or I like a girl or guy at my youth group who is also doing the famine, or my parents are making me, or I need the service hours for school. And so this is an easy way to bank service hours. I mean, those are some of the whys, to be sure, but there's a deeper why that gets into a theology of service and justice. And in fact, Dan, tonight at dinner, I'm going to be talking about this with my kids because I'm realizing that, our family serves, but I think we've gotten a little rusty on why we serve. And that's so important with that before piece. So tonight over dinner, leftovers. Luckily, I made a big crock pot meal this weekend, so we're still riding the coattails of those leftovers. We're going to talk about why do we serve? Why are we involved in God's kingdom work? And the definition of justice. And the way that I'm going to explain this, my husband and I are going to explain this tonight to our kids, is justice is simply righting wrongs. I mean, that's our kind of most fundamental, simplistic, stripped down understanding of justice, righting wrongs. And, my 9-year-old can get that. For my 15 and 13-year-old, we want to talk with them about, it's righting wrongs and it's restoring God's kingdom shalom. God's kingdom peace. And we think of peace as kind of warm and fuzzy peace or, peaceful relationships with others. But no, the kind of shalom, the kind of peace, the kind of flourishing that God longs for is holistic for our entire world. And so, when it becomes that before, during, and after, if I was to speak to a group of Famine students, one of the things that I would really want to zero in with them beforehand is, why are you doing this? Sure, it's, because of friendship and to get hours and because your youth pastor asked you to. But let's frame this in light of God's kingdom shalom. And then during, the beautiful thing about 30-hour famine is it's 30 hours. So there's all sorts of opportunities within that 30 hours. Yes, have fun, etc. But what are some of the meaningful conversations you can have? And I know World Vision gives some great resources to make this possible, to help young people really empathize with people around the world who don't have quite as much as they do when it comes to material possessions, or people around the world who are marginalized, impoverished, etc. So really taking advantage of that before window. And then lastly, before, during, and after. It's how do we help young people process this high and connect it with what they're going to experience in school the next week, how it relates to, that ever-ending quest for college admissions, especially for upperclassmen, how it relates to, when their mom or stepdad asks them to empty the dishwasher, how does that relate to 30-hour famine? So again, if I had a chance to be with 30-hour famine folks, I would love to sit with them and really help them unpack what this means for their next days, weeks, and months. And even a second piece I would add in that after is how to explain 30-hour famine to folks. The good news is 30-hour famine gives young people an opportunity to share a little bit about their faith. So, when it's Monday morning and someone at school says, hey, how was your weekend? Oh, it was cool. Might be an answer. Or you can say, oh, it was great. We did something at my church to really help people around the world. And all of a sudden, you've got a bit of a conversation opener. And part of what we can do as youth leaders and as adults investing in kids is frame that after. So fundamentally, out of our research, we're advocating for a much more comprehensive before, during, and after experience. And then if I could add one more thing, and this is really a layer that threads that weave their way through the before, during, and after. One of the most dominant pieces of research out of our Sticky Faith project is the importance of intergenerational relationships. And you already hinted at this, Dan, with your question. When most people read Sticky Faith or hear Sticky Faith speaker, this tends to be one of the things that is, in kind of bold italic letters for them. And here's the data behind it. We looked into 13 youth group participation variables, 13 things that the typical kid is involved in youth group. And to our delight, there's so much of that what we love in youth group that is related to mature faith in high school and college. But of the 13 youth group variables we looked at, the one that's most closely correlated with spiritual maturity, both in high school and college, is intergenerational relationships. Involving young people in the overall life of the church and connecting young people with adults. And the good news is 30-hour famine is so well poised to help young people do just that, to build relationships with adults. So, let's thread intergenerational relationships through this before, during, and after grid. Beforehand, how are youth leaders enabling young people to connect with adults in their church and have conversations, ask for prayer, connect with small groups, adult classes, whatever it might be, so that adults are connecting with kids before the project. During, is there a way for adults to somehow support kids and let them know they're fans of them? Just today, I got an email from a friend who's got a high school senior graduating, and a tradition in their school is that people write notes to encourage high school seniors and surprise the high school seniors, because they get this packet of notes from folks who just say, hey, here's what I appreciated about you. Here's how I'm praying for you. So I started writing that note this morning, and I'll finish it up tonight. But I'm sending that to a senior, so that she knows I, as an adult, am supporting her. But how can youth leaders similarly think about injecting the support of others, whether it be a note or video or phone call, text, whatever it might be, into that during process? And then lastly, after, what a wonderful opportunity for young people to sit, have coffee, or get together with adult classes from your church and just explain what God did and what they learned. So service is one of the most awesome ways for the generations to connect. Especially, let's be honest, a lot of adults, they don't really know how to connect with young people. They're maybe intimidated by that 16-year-old, and service gives them just an excuse, really. It lowers the barriers to bringing the generations together. So, for that adult who wants to connect with a 14 or an 18-year-old and doesn't know how, something like 30-hour famine, something like standing next to each other and painting a local public school, something like giving out sandwiches to folks who are homeless together. That drops some of the barriers between the generations. So we often say at the Fuller Youth Institute that service it's low-hanging fruit for intergenerational relationships. So out of our research, thrilled about the before, during, after process that 30-hour famine sets up so well, as well as these intergenerational threads that can weave their way throughout the whole experience.
I love this, and the timing for this conversation is especially great for us, Kara. We have 2 national dates that are kind of the focus for 30-hour famine in the year. One is in February, late in February, so those groups just finished.
Yeah.
So you're speaking to a group of people that just finished their famine event a week ago, last weekend, the weekend prior. So they're having those first couple of Wednesday night sessions, Sunday morning sessions with their groups. How do I talk to them to keep the experience fresh in ways very cool for you to encourage leaders to give some special words to say, here's one way of talking about your experience with your family, with your friends, to make that experience last a little bit. I want to share one example too of a youth leader that sent in. Here's what we did to include some other adults from their church into the 30-hour famine event. They took pictures of the students and put them in pockets on a huge poster on the wall, and then parents or friends or adults in the congregation would take one of the students, and then they would pray for them in preparation beforehand. They would let them know that they were like their sponsor for the 30-hour famine event. And awesome. Then when it came time to breaking the fast, they were there with them to go through that process. And it was a really cool thing for me, because that's what ties all that together. And it's not a parent, it's someone else that can influence their lives in a way towards Christ that becomes powerful and hopefully establishes that deeper relationship with Christ that sticks.
Great. Oh, I love that. That's an awesome idea of bringing together service and intergenerational relationships. Fabulous idea.
Yeah, I love that too. Certainly, we encourage leaders to do a service project as part of the 30 hours. As you know, 30 hours can be a very, very long time for folks. So including that in some way is highly encouraged for folks. So that's another way, of course, to involve intergenerational people into the famine process. So that's really great. I don't know. Is there anything else that you wanted to talk about? The folks that we have here obviously are some people that just finished FAM in February. We have a second national date in the end of April, so there's a little bit of time for those folks to prep a little bit for their event. And then I know that there are going to be some pastors and people that aren't necessarily involved with youth but care about youth and missions programs for their church. So those are the three audiences we have here. Is there anything specifically that you would want to say to the February leaders, April leaders, or senior pastors that are with us today?
Perfect question. Yeah, thanks, Dan. And yeah, there's actually plenty that I'd love to say. So I'm glad, and I do love the timing, and I know that our team and the World Vision team, we thought this would be the perfect time to talk to folks afterwards as well as before, that we're all kind of in the mix together on 30-hour famine. So I want to zero in a little bit more on the theology behind service and talk a little bit more about our sticky faith research. Because what we saw as we spent time with young people and asked them this question through a survey: what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? And we asked this at the end of the third year of college. So, they'd been at a youth group for 3 years, asked them, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? To be honest, when we asked that question in the survey, I thought, well, we're not really going to learn very much from it, but okay, we'll throw it in. I was totally wrong, because we actually learned a lot. Because when we ask young people, what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus? What does it mean to be a Christian? Over 1/3 of the young people who answered that question, what does it mean to be a Christian, didn't mention Jesus in their answer. Yeah, whoa is right. Yeah, thank you for that response, Dan. That's kind of what we thought. Whoa. Over 1/3 didn't mention Jesus. What did they say it means to be a follower? It means to be a Christian. They said things like, well, the most dominant answer was, we love people. Now, does Jesus want us to love people? Yes, Jesus does. But, I could go to the nearest Starbucks and start talking to folks there and say, is it a good thing to love people? And people would say back to me, yes. Surely there has to be something more robust, more sticky about our faith than good behaviors like love and like service. So out of our research, we're saying, you know what, young people, they have sadly bought into what Dallas Willard calls the gospel of sin management. A gospel that's all about a behavioral checklist. And so, we can even put, sadly, 30-hour famine on that behavioral checklist, that, just like God will like me a little bit more if I do my devotions, and God will like me a little bit more if I pray for my non-Christian friends, God's going to somehow like me a little bit more if I carve out the time for 30-hour famine. And that just grieves me, that service would be lumped into this behavioral, moralistic version of faith. What separates Christianity from every other religion is grace. Grace, grace, grace. And what I would long for 30-hour famine, both before and after, is that as we talk about that why question, that it's all grounded in a sense of God's grace. How can we right wrongs? Because we are people who are saved by God's grace, and then we are like tunnels through which the Holy Spirit blows. And one of my favorite scripture passages in all of the Bible, in fact, my husband and I, we had it read at our wedding, is John 15, that as we abide, we bear fruit. And that's what I long for young people to know, is that it's God's grace that helps us bear fruit. So when it comes to things like famine, or, we're in a Lent season now, and as my husband and I, as we sat around our kitchen table and talked with our kids about Lent, we literally got out a whiteboard and we wrote out my favorite understanding of the gospel. And, I have a PhD in practical theology, hence all the books. And I've thought a lot about the gospel, and this is my favorite way of explaining the gospel. It's 5 words that all start with G. And I mean, I could poke holes at some things that I wish, are a little bit limited in this 5-word understanding, but it is my favorite way of explaining the gospel, especially to teenagers. And those 5 words are guilt, we are created good. We're created good in God's image. We know this from Genesis. We're created good in God's image. Our guilt or our sin separates us from God. And God couldn't stand that. So by God's grace, God sent Jesus that we might have real life in the present as well as eternal life with God. And in the midst of this process of experiencing God, we don't do it on our own. We become part of God's people. God's people. Now, why do we serve? Why do we obey? It's not to make God like us more, make God love us more. It's because we're so full of gratitude. And that's the 5th G. So, when it comes to having conversations with folks, whether you're a parent, a youth leader, a senior pastor, a missions pastor, before and after the famine, please, I urge you, I beg of you, please, let's present a gospel to young people that doesn't make them think that they have to earn God's favor. Let's present a gospel that lets young people rest in God's grace and recognize that it's out of God's grace that we then serve God out of gratitude. Or as I love saying to young people, so that our lives become great big thank you notes back to God. So before, after the famine, let's frame what we do in service and justice, the way we right wrongs and restore God's kingdom shalom out of grace. I want to add one other piece to this too, as we think about before and after. There's one group of folks that we have not mentioned, and I'll tell you, they have a phenomenal potential to impact young people and build sticky faith and build intergenerational relationships before, during, and after the famine. And that is senior adults. Senior adults, I'll tell you, we have seen over the last years in Sticky Faith, there's just a special tenderness between teenagers and senior adults. And I wish I had a more like researchy, psychologically grounded word for it, but I'm just going to go with tenderness. There's just a special tenderness. And so if you're a missions pastor, senior pastor, youth pastor, and you're wondering how do we surround our kids with intergenerational relationships, one of the first places I'd be looking in my church community is where are the senior adults? Where are the senior adults who are praying for their own grandkids, that God will bring an adult into their own grandkids' life? And how can we say to those senior adults, hey, how about you being an answer to prayer for some other grandparent who's praying that same prayer and their grandkids are in your congregation? So senior adults, gathering senior adults with students ahead of time, having them be prayer partners, giving out prayer bookmarks, the kind of thing that you talked about, Dan, where there's a display in the lobby where students can actually be kind of sponsored by adults in the church. How wonderful for senior adults to do that. Involving senior adults during the famine. How can they be hosts, supporters, cheerleaders? How can they bring donuts not donuts, sorry. Bad, that doesn't work. But how can they bring water and be supportive in that tangible way? And then after, how can young people connect with senior adults afterwards? So in the midst of this before, during, after process, understanding that it's God's grace that motivates everything that we do. And we don't have to earn God's favor. There's so many 16 and 14 and 18-year-olds, they're so used to trying to achieve. And Christianity's so countercultural to that. And I want young people to know that. And then also there's this amazing team, amazing tribe, probably in every church watching this webinar, and that's senior adults. So how can we empower them, mobilize them, et cetera?
Yeah, I love that. Something that I'm passionate about with youth is, so often I hear from youth leaders is that sometimes they're almost encouraged to take the youth away to a separate space, and so they can be loud and be youthy and obnoxious in who they are as young people. And I love to hear your passion about how do you involve the youth into the life of the church, and how can they be a vibrant part along with the adults to have a full rounded church and congregation and vibrant faith for everybody. I think it nurtures relationships both ways in that regard.
Absolutely. I mean, and that's how God's designed our kingdoms to our communities to work, is to be mutual relationship across the generations. And so often in churches today, young people are segregated or separated from the rest of the church. And segregation, that's not a term I use lightly, but the reality is that's what's happening in churches today. And service and ministries like 30-Hour Famine, they're just so well positioned and poised to bring the generations together and help usher the church into a whole new realm of deeper relationships. So I think there's amazing potential there when it comes to intergenerational relationships.
Yeah, I agree. Just a reminder to everybody's listening right now that if you have any questions, we're getting close to that time. If you want to email your questions to bnelson@fuller.edu, we'll be able to get to those in a minute here. Kara, one of the things that I know about this time period, we're in the middle of it for Famine, and that's great. I know that Famine for youth leaders and youth pastors is a large event. It takes time. They have to plan it. You have to get volunteers. You get opportunity for youth leaders, and that's awesome around the big events. And 30 hours, it breaks down the wall. So it's one of those events where you really can dig in and touch into the lives of students. And mission trips the same way. Big event. Students love coming to it. They love inviting their friends to it, and it becomes a larger engagement for the youth leader. Are there any things in the study or research that you've done that I know this is a bit of a wild card, but speaks to ways that youth leaders and pastors can speak to the new students that come to those big events, and ways that you can talk after an event or before an event that can help make it stickier for them, so that they'll want to stay a part of that group in a longer extended period of time?
Yeah, fantastic question. And I agree with you and the premise behind your question, that it's hard to imagine a better way for young people who are new to the faith, new to the church, to get a glimpse of what it means to follow Jesus than by being involved in service. So right. I think that's fantastic. If I could go back in youth ministry and rewind the clock to me being a youth pastor at the two churches where I was a youth pastor, one of the things I would do differently is I would do fewer events, but I would make them count more. I felt so often as a youth pastor that we were just kind of breathlessly running from event to event. And we were not really maximizing any one event because we always had our eye on the next event. Okay, we're back from this retreat. Okay, phew, now we've got to do the next 2 weeks of programming for this next big event. Okay, right. Now 30-hour Famine is just around the corner, but then after 30-hour Famine, we have a senior retreat. And so how's that all going to work, et cetera. So if I could go back, I would probably cut the number of events that I do as a youth pastor by at least 20%, probably more like 30%. And I would build into my schedule and the event schedule more of a rhythm that allowed greater process and greater relational depth. So, the example that you just gave, where young people, new students are coming to the church because of 30-hour Famine, that's awesome. Have I, as a youth pastor, blocked out time in my schedule the next week to take, if Maria is the student who comes and she is brought by her friend Gabriella, have I blocked out time in my calendar next week to take out Maria and Gabriella for dinner or coffee and just find out what they thought? All too often, we don't have time because we're thinking about Wednesday, Sunday, and the next big event. So I think I skimmed the surface of the potential of what various events meant for our students as a youth pastor because I was just trying to do so much. So I would say, do less and do it better. And what that tends to mean is that then you have windows of time for greater relationships. Greater relationships is with new and old students who come to Famine. And, we don't just have to do this face-to-face. There's a little thing called the internet and social media that we can use to stay in touch with students. So, figure out what is the venue, or maybe it's group texts. To be honest, at our church, that's how a lot of the conversations happen with my two teenage kids and their friends and the youth pastor is by group texts. And so how are you leveraging that afterwards as a way to just keep Famine in front of students? So, for those of you who just did Famine in February, how can you, even this week, it's Tuesday right now, how can you do a group text today or whatever works for your students? Whatever social media or digital ways they stay in community with each other, jump on those and use those. So, how can you send out a group text today? Hey, remember when we blah, 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 I'm still praying and thinking about, and I just love how you were involved in God's justice work on Tuesday, and do the same on Friday. I mean, don't overwhelm students, or don't be like that weird stalker youth leader. But again, social media and text, etc., they're just wonderful tools for us to stay in touch afterwards. And for those of you who are looking ahead to 30-hour Famine in April, same principle applies. How can you use group text, social media, Facebook, etc., to start building expectation with your students, to let them know what to be praying for? So, it doesn't have to be an event in isolation, we can build this relational climate before and after that helps the seeds that were planted during go even deeper. There's one group of students that we haven't talked about yet, Dan, and those are the students who didn't go on 30-hour famine, but are part of the youth ministry. And I think a lot of times we forget them. And I, as a student myself, as a teenager, I was on both sides. I did 30-hour famine, but then there was also a year or two where I didn't do 30-hour famine. And I remember feeling like my friends had this amazing experience. They were talking about it with their youth pastor. They had all these inside jokes, and I just felt more and more isolated and more excluded from this high of the youth group. So part of what we say out of our deep justice work and our sticky faith work is, how can we help an entire youth ministry, even those who didn't attend 30-hour famine, feel like they're part of what God's doing? So, the same kind of principles apply when it comes to communicating with your whole youth ministry. However you communicate with the students in your youth ministry, use that to let, in the midst of 30-hour famine, to say, hey, please be praying for blah, blah, blah. So appreciate your support, even those of you who couldn't come. We never want people to feel spiritually inferior or somehow excluded because they can't come to an event. A lot of times there's valid conflicts that just prevent them from coming. And so I would urge youth leaders, missions pastors, senior pastors to think about the overall tribe of young people. And when it comes to afterwards, how can those who didn't attend 30-hour famine feel extra invited to whatever service you're doing after 30-hour famine? How can you make a special effort to reach out to those students and say, hey, we missed you at famine, would have been even better with you, but now we're going to go and we're painting the nearest shelter for folks who are homeless Saturday morning from 9 to 11. Would love it if you could swing by. So I think, again, if we're doing fewer activities, we have more time to build relationships with those who are new, as well as those who weren't at 30-hour famine, but we still care about and God still cares about.
Yeah, I sometimes forget about that student too.
Yeah.
I was trained to be a teacher. That's part of my background, and one of the pieces that's really, really difficult for teachers is sometimes you get caught calling on the same student over and over and over again, or the same small group of students over and over and over again, because they raise their hand a lot. You're going to get a good answer from them, and it creates an easier atmosphere, honestly.
Yeah.
And sometimes the great conversations happen when you get that person that doesn't want to raise their hand, but that they're thinking deeply about something. And how do you stretch them to be someone that's willing to share and enrich the conversation rather than just the people that are the hand raisers? So that's super powerful.
Such a good insight, Dan, and I know you're right. And I think it's actually been studied and talked about more in the educational classroom environment than it has in the church youth group environment. But I, as a youth pastor, there were seasons where I did the same thing. I focused on the youth group superstars, and in a sense, sure, investing in leaders makes sense. But what I was blind to is that every young person is created good, like we said, is created in God's image. Every young person has potential and passion and gifts. And so many teenagers, the vast majority of teenagers walk around feeling kind of unremarkable. They don't feel like they stand out at school. They don't feel like they stand out in any kind of extracurriculars in a dramatic way. And then they come to church, and once again, we make them feel unremarkable because they couldn't come to the famine or whatever it might be. And so, I never want, I want church to be the place, I want youth group to be the place where young people feel the most accepted and the most seen and the most acknowledged for who they are. And often that means time from adults. Us as youth pastors, as well as those volunteers that we're equipping and nurturing so that they can also invest in those kids who maybe aren't the first ones to sign up or only come to your church once or twice a month. Like, how do we have a special plan and heart and passion and compassion for those students?
That's great. I want to peel back just a little bit. Thank you. Obviously, I have a passion for youth and clearly a love for the 30-hour famine leaders. And thank you for speaking directly to them today. It's powerful. It's encouraging. I hope that all the youth leaders and youth pastors out there today feel more empowered and cared for after the conversation we've had. So thank you for that. I want to peel back just a little bit. I know that there's some pastors who are listening in today that their focus is the entire congregation, the entirety of the church. And there's a team of people that work with the youth specifically. But for those senior pastors that are listening today, is there anything from the Sticky Faith Service Guide that you can say directly to them as some encouragement of how they can speak to the entire congregation or to encourage their youth pastor and youth as well?
Absolutely. And there's one group that we barely touched on, and we can't finish this webinar without doing a deeper dive to understand them, and that is parents. I'm a parent of a 15 and 13 and 9-year-old, and I just tweeted yesterday, I pray for wisdom as a parent more than any other role in my life by far. And it was interesting how many parents responded and said, yeah, me too, or by galaxies. Being a parent is just so hard. And yet, here's what's encouraging to parents is that as much influence as the church has, and as youth ministry has, and as service events like 30-Hour Famine have, as much influence as all that has, it's hard to point to any single factor that influences a young person and their faith trajectory more than their parents. And I say that, and that's both encouraging and terrifying to me as a parent, even when I think about how I blew it yesterday with my 2 daughters and had to apologize to them. So parents, there's just amazing potential for them when it comes to deepening the fruit in young people's lives that come from ministries like 30-Hour Famine. And a lot of times the youth pastor doesn't quite have the access, or I'll even say maybe credibility with parents, that senior pastor, that executive pastor, that missions pastor has. So whatever your role is at your church, when it comes to 30-Hour Famine, I would urge you to think about how can we partner with parents in this service experience? How can parents feel like they're a part? And as a parent myself, I mean, that starts with pretty basic things like, please communicate with me. Like, just please communicate with me. Let me know what's going on. Let me know when my kid needs to be where. If there are before and after gatherings you have for your students, you set my family up for success when you communicate those, not just to the student, but also to me. So, at the fundamental level, parental communication. But then I would say there's more that can be added on that in terms of parental involvement. How are you engaging parents in the process? When it comes to doing that before or that after conversation, how are parents included in that? I love what our youth pastor did before our last high school ministry short-term mission trip. He had a meeting where parents were strongly encouraged to come. I think in the future he'll call it mandatory parent meeting. And he just had parents pray for and affirm their students in small groups before the trip. And I think, what a wonderful element to add to 30-Hour Famine is parents affirming and praying for their students beforehand. And then afterwards, some fascinating research actually done by both MTV as well as Diana Garland, who recently passed away but was a faculty member at Baylor University, shows how important it is for families to serve together. And this has been pretty mind-blowing for the Powell family, because while we've believed in service since our marriage started, when it came to our kids serving, generally they were serving in ways different than us, in different times, in different places. So, my husband is on basically our deacon board. I serve in all sorts of ways through Fuller, and our kids were serving through church as well as through Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and school opportunities. And out of this research, we're saying, how can the 5 of us actually serve together? There's something about serving together as a family that's highly generative. It leads to great conversations, great insights, great laughs, conflict that then you have to work through. And so, 30-Hour Famine, I would say when it comes to thinking about what are we doing after 30-Hour Famine, is there a way that if you planned a service experience, as I mentioned, if you're painting a local nonprofit some Saturday morning from 9 to 11, can that be something that parents are also invited to? And it becomes a whole family service project as a way to follow up afterwards. So, And then, one other piece afterwards, which is a little bit easier even than events, is just letting parents know how they can talk to their kids about what they experienced. I remember a short-term missions experience at our church with our middle schoolers, and part of it ended up being in our backyard because they needed some place to do a little bit of that during processing. So they were in our backyard, and I said to our middle school pastor, hey, I would love to know like what scripture passages you were talking about, and any other highlights from this experience so that I can process it with my child. And he looked at me like with this total surprise look on his face. Like it didn't occur to him that I, as a parent, would want to know some conversation handholds to talk to about my kids. So, I would say youth leaders, missions pastors, senior pastors, how can you give parents a couple questions that they can ask in the car ride home, in the dinner afterwards? Encourage parents to, pick their kids up from 30-hour famine and go right to coffee or right to a meal. That's a practice that we do in our family. Is I don't even want the kids to get home. I take time off work. I do whatever I can because, right after that event, it's the best time to talk to them. So I let the kids pick where they go, and after 30-hour famine, they're going to be hungry. So I let them pick where they want to go to eat or grab a shake or whatever it might be, and that's our after conversation. And it's all the better when the church has provided tools for me to talk about, like, oh, so I know that you were looking at Micah and what it means to be involved in justice. What do you think that means? Set parents up for success in conversation by giving them tools. So partnering with parents, so important in all aspects of ministry and service. This 30-hour service event is a great way to think about giving tools beforehand for parents and then involving them afterwards in conversation and even joint actual service together.
Yeah, that's great. A couple things about that. One, we just did this past summer, we had interns at World Vision, and just out of curiosity, we asked them, have you ever fasted? And almost all of them said yes. It was like high 90% said yes. And then we asked them a follow-up question is, do you remember the first meal that you had after your fast? And 100% knew exactly what they had after their fast. Yeah. So it validates that point that you just made, that experience right after the fast becomes a powerful experience in reaching into their life.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, some of the best conversations I have with my kids all year are after church events. When I pick them up in the church parking lot, especially something like 30-hour famine, retreat, camp, other service events, and we go right to a restaurant. I don't care about the laundry. My kids are smelly and they need a shower desperately. And, I don't care about any of that. Like, we're going to have a conversation. So.
Yep, that's great. Also, for the family leaders that are out there, brand new this year, we included something we call a parent pack. So we have some information for the student on how to do some fundraising, how to talk to people about the famine, and for the parents, what the famine is and what their child's going to experience through the famine, and then some questions that they can ask afterwards. So at a meal or a week later or a month later, how do you follow up with your child with some questions that we queued up for them? So awesome.
Fabulous. And one of the ways that we do that in the Powell family is we do a beans and rice dinner about every month. And it's our way of empathizing with how much of the world eats. And we try to have a better conversation about service and justice and poverty around the world. So, and I got to be honest, my kids don't love the beans and rice dinner, but we're still doing it because I want them to have that experience. So I love the way that 30-hour famine and World Vision are already positioning parents to win. That's fantastic.
Right.
We have gotten some questions, Dan. I'd love to throw some.
Let's do it.
If that's okay. Awesome.
Yeah, go for it.
This is a very great and poignant question, and we often get asked this by leaders as well as parents. What if my student doesn't want to go on a mission trip or serve in general? We've kind of been operating on the assumption in this webinar that students are going to want to serve, and that's certainly true quite a bit of the time. But there are often students who don't want to serve. Now, if that was my kid, let me speak as a parent first. If that was my kid, I would try to figure out why is it that they don't want to serve. And my experience as a youth leader is that 9 out of 10 times that kids don't want to go to church or don't want to be involved in church activities, they might say it's boring. They might say, I don't like the teaching or whatever it might be, or I don't grow or whatever. 9 out of 10 times it's social. 9 out of 10 times they don't feel socially connected. And so that's why they don't want to be involved in activities. And the problem is, though, that if the only way to get connected socially is to attend and show up and be involved. So we create this tragic snowball where a student doesn't feel connected, so therefore they don't come to church, and therefore they don't feel connected and they don't come to church or other activities like 30-hour famine, etc. So what I would say is if you're a parent and your student doesn't want to serve or doesn't want to be involved in a mission trip, I would talk to a youth leader, call them up, text them, email them and say, hey, my kid doesn't want to go. I think it might be because they're not connected socially. How do you feel like my kid is doing socially? And you get the perspective of an adult, small group leader, or youth pastor who sees your kids socially and might have some insights on what's going on socially, as well as might have some insights on some potential friends for your kid that can make a difference. A lot of times students feel disconnected because they look and they feel like, well, everybody has other friends, and they don't see the kids standing around the perimeter of the room who also are not really connecting socially. So, I always tell my kids when we're going to a new environment, like, look for the kids who don't have other friends. That's a great place to start. So I would say, approach it primarily from a social angle. And then I would also say, for that youth leader to specifically encourage kids one-on-one, here's what I would love for you to come. I see great potential in you. You have amazing abilities when it comes to technology. I know God's going to use that, and we could really use your help. With the 30-hour famine, here are our technology needs. Can you come? Can you serve, etc. So it's both a social approach as well as just one-on-one invitations, letting kids know the sparks, the potential you see in them, and how 30-hour famine can help draw that out. So that's my first answer. But Dan, I'd be curious, do you have anything to add to that based on your work with young people and your work with 30-hour famine? How can you help that youth leader, that parent who they're hearing about kids who want to serve and they look around and go, well, that's not true of the student or students that I'm closest to?
Well, this is a spirit of transparency, Kara.
Yeah.
I honestly wasn't even listening to the question. So I apologize to everyone out there. I can't share my wisdom, and honestly, I hope that people were here to share about your wisdom. But honestly, I was thinking about how am I going to wrap this up in an appropriate way to everybody that's listening today. So
no problem.
How about that?
It's funny, Dan, when you said, like, I'm going to share transparently, I thought, oh, Dan's going to really open up. And, I was expecting this.
Some deep emotional experience.
Yes. I thought it was going to be like an Oprah moment.
How about that?
But that's totally okay. No problem. Let me go on to another question that I think is a great one.
I'll listen this time.
Okay, awesome. What are some easy ways I can talk with my students about serving even when we don't have anything planned at the moment? And again, that's a wonderful question, because one of the assumptions we've had on this webinar is that a ministries or a family is involved in ongoing service. Well, I'll go back to what I said about the beans and rice dinner that the Powell family has. That's a way to connect even when we're not actually getting in the car or not actually doing a service event, we're still having the conversation. So, what I would say to that youth ministry or to that family, the tragic news is that our world reveals all sorts of injustice. Every day in the news, there's a story about, whether it's local or global, about injustices happening, whether it's what's happening in, well, I won't get into all the issues, but there are all sorts of opportunities to have good conversations. So I would say, how can you use even current events as a springboard? For youth leaders, how can prayer and praying for people around the world be part of your ongoing spiritual practices that you do as a community? So, maybe the first Sunday of every month, even if you're not at that month actively involving students in service, maybe you're praying for what God is doing through World Vision, or for what God is doing in particular areas around the globe these days with the immigrant crisis and refugees, etc. What a wonderful way, what an important need for our young people to be aware of. When the media moves on, let's not move on as a church, and let's remember to pray for those folks. So I would say, even if you're not do an active, hands-on service, the way you talk about service, the way you pray for service, all of those can be great triggers that any church, any youth group, any family can do really anytime.
And from a 30-hour family perspective, it doesn't have to be part of a larger event for something like that too. I would encourage leaders out there to use their own personal example as a way to help draw students into that experience and say, why don't you come with me as I go do this service project and that type of aspect. So it's maybe a time with 1 or 2 students as opposed to a larger, huge project. And if there's not the time for that, there's still a time to take some students with you to a smaller service event. And if you're looking for some examples, we try to share as many as we can from a global perspective within the materials and resources in the 30-hour famine. And you can pull from those and find someplace in your community where you can help lead a student into a service project.
Yeah, I just got to say, the resources that the 30-hour famine team offers to support this before, during, and after mindset, to support parents, to support the intergenerational relationships, they're just marvelous. So for you who are watching and maybe haven't plumbed those resources, haven't checked them all out, I'd encourage you to take a few minutes sometime today, check them out, because I almost guarantee you that you'll find something you're going to want to use with your students in those resources.
Kara, I don't know, are there any other questions there before we wrap up, or are we at that point?
I think we've covered all of them that came in. There's a question about parents who are not involved in the church, but I think that was encompassed when we talked about parents in general. So no, I think we're good on responding to the most pressing needs of folks who are watching today.
Well, let me say on behalf of everybody that was on today and that will see this going forward in the future, just want to say thank you for not only sharing with us today, but doing the research and sharing from your own practical examples of being a parent, what that can mean to help us be better at the youth work that we do. And I know that today we've been talking for roughly about an hour, but we're just touching the surface of the resources that you have that you can share with us to help us in that way. So the Sticky Face Service Guide and the companion student journal is a great way for our leaders and pastors out there to not only take the nuggets that you shared with us today, but to dig deeper and find more practical ways that they can use service events like the 30-hour famine and mission trips, and how do they deepen the relationships that students have with Christ through those events. And I think that's everybody's goal that's listening today. So thank you so much, not only for this hour, but thank you for doing the research that helps us be better at what we do. I can't thank you enough for that.
Dan, my pleasure. And I would say all the same back to you folks at World Vision. We love partnering with World Vision and 30-hour famine. So thank you for the way that God is working both in and through your ministry and organization also. And thank you to everyone watching for caring so much about young people and to see God's kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven.
Well, thanks, Kara. What's the best way? I know that for us, we use the website at 30hourfamine.org. Is the Fuller Youth Institute, is that the best way for people to find out more information about you, or where would you have people go?
Yeah, thanks for asking. FullerYouthInstitute.org. That's our best portal to all sorts of free, low-cost resources. And leaders and parents can sign up there for free resources that can come into your inbox every month to help you build deeper faith in young people.
Well, thanks, Kara. Thanks for everybody else that was on the webinar today. Just want you to know that as our family leader here at World Vision, I'm praying for you. Love all that you do to help students draw nearer to Christ, and the pastors there, World Vision, prays for you, loves the work that you do, loves that you are caring and nurturing for the flock in your church. Thank you for everything that you do and for this past hour. Here's me signing off. Thanks, Kara.